You know, one of our roles as the NIADA is to continue to build broad coalitions in the industry for the best interests of our members and our dealers. And one of those important key relationships for us is the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And recently, last year, NIADA joined the Small Business Council of the Chamber of Commerce. And I'd like to think that we are continuing to build and grow the relationship that we have with the Chamber of Commerce, which is one of the largest advocacy groups on behalf of small businesses in our country, as you all know. So we're super thrilled today to have Neil Bradley come and talk to us a little bit about the state of American business and what is going on with the economy and some of the other things. Neil is the Executive Vice President and Chief Policy Officer at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and keeping our Marketplace Keynote series on track and going. Please join me in welcoming Neil Bradley to the stage to talk about the state of American business. Neil?
Well, good morning. All right, come on. Good morning. All right, that's a little better. Well, thank you. First, thanks for letting me spend a few minutes with you today. More importantly, thanks for getting me out of Washington, D.C. Washington is a very nice town to visit. Happens to be a bit of a bubble, if you haven't noticed sometimes, with a lot of circus-style craziness going on. So any chance I can get out of D.C. and spend it with real folks who are driving the economy, creating jobs, and creating wealth, I always take advantage of the opportunity. Let me tell you a little bit about, for those of you who don't know, about the U.S. Chamber. We are the largest business organization representing the interests of business in the United States. We were founded 107 years ago at the request of President Taft to do two things, and that remains our mission today. One, to represent the interests of the business community, and two, to help the government. Today, we count over 3 million American businesses that we represent their interests for in the halls of Congress and with executive agencies. We have a federation of state and local chambers. Many of you probably belong to your state and local chamber. Little tidbit, most of those actually preceded the U.S. Chamber. Our original founding members were those local chambers that many of you belong to. Today, we participate with them in a federation, helping to influence policy at both the state and the federal level. We also operate internationally. We have 117 AmChams abroad, about any country that you'll go to where there's an American company operating, there's an American Chamber of Commerce there, making sure that the interests of American businesses is being looked out for. While we do represent the vast majority of Fortune 100 and Fortune 500 members, we've never forgotten where we came from. And the fact is, 95% of those 3 million businesses that we represent the interests of are small businesses. And we make sure that they always have a voice in the policy considerations that we work on behalf of the American business community. Today, I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about 3 distinct subjects. One, the state of the American economy, where we've come from, where we are today, what the future might look like. 2, public policy and how that might aid or abet where we want to see the economy go. And then 3rd, I'd like to spend and close out with talking a little bit about what we see as the medium and long-term structural challenges that the U.S. Chamber, NIADA, and all of us represent in making sure that we have a government that is actually focused on creating American jobs and growing our economy. So let's start with the economy. To understand where we are today in the economy, it's important to understand where we came from. You know, in America, there's always been this promise since World War II, and that promise was that each generation would be better off than the generation before. It's something our grandparents believed, our parents believed, something that we believe, but a belief in that we saw diminished in our kids over the last decade. One of the things that we went out and did some research on was, why was that view diminishing? It turns out economics actually explains a lot of it. from World War II all the way to 2006, that entire time span, during high growth periods and recessions, every year the U.S. economy, on average, grew 3.5%. Now, 3.5% doesn't sound like a whole lot, but you all know well, and as we just heard, miracles of compound, 3% on average a year, every year, produces marvelous results. It actually produces a result in our national economy where our standard of living, the size of our economy per person, doubles roughly every 22 to 24 years. Think about that. A child who's born, goes through kindergarten, grade school, high school, goes to college and graduates. And that time frame, at that growth rate, the standard of living in the United States has doubled. No wonder we all believed and took to the bank the idea that each successive generation would be better off than the generation before. Then something happened. And it started before the Great Recession, but was certainly compounded by it. And we had a decade of something no one in America has ever experienced, sub 3% growth. For an entire, actually just over a decade, the American economy couldn't get much above 2% and couldn't even reach 3%, which is much smaller than the historical norm. I call it the lost decade because you know what the difference is between a 2% growth rate and a 3 and a 3.5% growth rate in terms of people terms? It's not just a point, it's half. And the difference in terms of doubling our standard of living is that same person who was born today, goes to kindergarten, goes to grade school, goes to high school, goes to college, spends all of their 20s and halfway through their 30s before the economy ever catches up again. We heard a little bit earlier today about millennials who are postponing these decisions, big life decisions, getting married, buying a car, buying a house by, on average, 5 years. Well, you know what? Because the standard of living of the economy is being delayed by even more than 5 years. That's why folks began to lose hope. Now, if we had a lost decade, we've had some good news of recent, and that good news is shown by the fact that that red line ticks up towards the end. In 2017, 2018, and in the first quarter of 2019, where we saw above 3% economic growth. We're not where we need to be, but we're turning in the right direction. We're reversing that lost decade. And the difference that makes, you all see it in your businesses, and we see it in our communities. We also see it in some of the work that we do. I mentioned that 95% of our members are small businesses. We go out in conjunction with MetLife every quarter, and we survey small businesses. And we ask them about the state of the economy in the area in which they operate, the state of the economy, their views on it nationally, and also their own projections. What do they think their own business is going to look like? Do they think revenue is going to grow over the next 6 months, or do they think it's going to contract? That index, and you add all those inputs together and it gives us an index, has been steadily growing, reaching a record for the second quarter of 2019 that we just released last week of 68.7. Anything above 50 means we're growing and expanding. A mark of 68.7 means that folks are optimistic about the future. And they should be, because we've seen a lot of brighter days. Here's some good news facts that don't make it on the nightly news very often. We have the lowest unemployment rate today that we've had since 1969. 50 years. We've never experienced unemployment like this for most of us in our adult, and certainly our adult or working lives. We also have wage growth. People complain for a while, okay, well, we're getting jobs, but wages aren't growing. People's sense of having money in their pocket and being able to spend it. Well, that's begun changing too. As the labor force, the tightness of the labor market has had an impact on wages, and we just saw the first part of this year, the fastest wage growth in a decade. That means people have jobs, they're competing for jobs, their wages are rising, and they have a better outlook about the future. But it doesn't mean that everything is all sunshine. If I were given this presentation 6 months ago, I would have skipped over this next slide, because I would have told you that all the talk that you saw on cable news was really a bunch of people trying to talk down the economy, trying to convince us all that we were on the verge of a recession. Now, part of that's because we are now, last month, we entered the longest expansionary period in our economy in history, the longest period of time where the economy has been growing without a recession. And so a lot of people thought, well, certainly we must be due for one. Well, recessions don't just happen. Recessions happen because someone makes a policy mistake, which we're going to get back to in a second. But the reason this slide's here today, and it wouldn't have been 6 months ago, is that an honest look at the data shows that something is happening in the economy. The growth that I showed when we were exceeding 3% in the first quarter of GDP, that's beginning to slow. There's deceleration going on. We're growing, we're just not growing as fast as we were the last couple of years. We see weakness in key sectors. It started with housing. We're seeing it currently in manufacturing, and we're concerned that that's going to spread to other industrial sectors of the economy. You saw all this come together in a real simple indication of what the folks who spend every day poring over numbers think about the potential of the future. When the Federal Reserve in the last month went from openly talking about raising interest rates for the remainder of the year to lowering interest rates. Now, that's been really great for the stock market. The stock market shot up on the news that the Federal Reserve might cut interest rates. But it also tells you something about the underlying fundamentals and what economists are worried about our potential growth. And just this morning, if you didn't see the news report, J.P. Morgan, which spends a lot of time looking at the economy, increased their possibility of a recession in the next year from 20% to 45%. Now, I want to be clear about something. I'm not predicting a recession, and neither is J.P. Morgan. 45% is still below 50%. But what it means is that the growth that we've seen in the last 2 years that provided us a tremendous cushion, a cushion of growth where businesses could gamble and make decisions. Speaking of gambling in the city of Las Vegas, where you could gamble with investments, where policy mistakes in Washington or in your state capitals, where we could endure them because the economy was growing so fast, that cushion is diminishing. And when that cushion diminishes, it does two things that as an advocacy organization we pay a lot of attention to. One, it increases the risk of a policy mistake. That if Washington were to get something wrong, either at the Federal Reserve, at one of the agencies, or in Congress, we have less room for error and we could push the economy into a recession. The second, and this is the flip side of that coin, there's tremendous upside potential if we get policy right. And if you want to understand how policy makes a difference in this framework, consider going back to this chart. Getting to that yellow bar didn't happen by accident. It happened because we fundamentally changed policy. We cut taxes and reformed the tax code for the first time in 30 years. And you've already heard this morning about some of the deregulatory efforts of the Trump administration. For the first time in history, since the federal government has kept score, the actual regulatory costs that the government imposes on the economy went down, not up. That unleashed some animal spirits and made that yellow bar possible. So we have to keep continuing to get policy right, and we have to avoid policy mistakes. So let's talk about some of those policies. I'd like to begin with one that would be a huge mistake, and that's tariffs. Let me be very clear. Tariffs are taxes. No two ways about it. When the federal government imposes a tariff on something, it is U.S. businesses and U.S. consumers who pay that cost. And we've had a lot of talk about tariffs over the last couple of years. We've had a lot of new tariffs go into effect. Just last week, there was a threat on tariffs of 5% on all imports from Mexico. Now, we import a lot of stuff from Mexico. They happen to be our #1 trading partner at the moment, actually even bigger than China. I happen to pull some of the numbers from some of the countries and the trading regions that you're seeing in the news just for auto parts. The U.S. imports $158 billion worth of auto parts. Some of that in the North American supply chain, particularly for new vehicles, is parts going back and forth multiple times. Imagine if just on Mexico we imposed a tax of 5% on every part that came into the country. China, we're looking at taxes of 25%. This is costs that are being borne by consumers, by many of you, by folks who are importing. One of the things that we're fighting at the U.S. Chamber is saying that tariffs are not an answer to every single geopolitical problem that our nation faces. And the reality is we have to understand that when we impose tariffs, we're imposing costs on our economy. It's the same thing as if the local government raised your taxes. It's the same thing as if the federal government raised your taxes. And when that does, that's a net drag on the economy. We were very pleased that the administration in Mexico announced a deal that avoided those tariffs that were threatened on Mexican imports. We're encouraging the administration in China to come together and reach a deal sooner rather than later to remove the tariffs that have been imposed on Chinese imports over the last couple of years. And by the way, as an aside, the president actually deserves some credit here. China has been abusing its relationship with the United States and the American business community for a long time. They've been stealing our intellectual property. They've been forcing businesses to localize over there so that they can make it easier when they want to steal the intellectual property of American businesses. And they've been using their state programs, the fisc of the public, to generate subsidies and unfair competition. The president deserves credit for taking that on and bringing China to the table, but we need to get a deal, because if we don't get a deal, we're not going to resolve those problems, and in the meantime, we'll continue paying tariffs and taxes on things like that $20 billion in auto part imports. And of course, there's also the threat of taxes on all auto imports and automotive parts imports that the president unveiled last year. It's what's called a 301 investigation. It's hanging out there. There could be tariffs imposed at any time. It's kind of like a sword of Damocles hanging over all of our allies, whether that's Japan or Europe or Mexico, with the threat of tariffs. So that's a potential policy mistake. There's also fiscal mistakes. There's no doubt that Washington, well, let's just say they're not very prudent when it comes to fiscal responsibility. Earlier this year, we had the longest government shutdown in American history. It was over 45 days. We have another threat of a government shutdown this October, when annual spending bills have to be approved. For the first time since 2011, we have the threat of a potential default on the sovereign debt of the United States. If that were to occur, that's something that's never happened before, and it would send financial markets into turmoil and the cost of borrowing through the roof. And then come January, we have automatic spending cuts to defense and education and infrastructure programs, veterans programs, the other domestic side of the ledger, of $126 billion that both parties want to avoid. Now, it's no secret that the president and the new Democratic House don't get along very well. And in that kind of environment, we worry about missed assumptions and policy mistakes and another government shutdown or a default on the debt that could inject more uncertainty into the business climate and could undermine that lower rate of growth that we're on. We can't afford those type of policy mistakes, and we're paying very close attention to them and working with both Republicans and Democrats to avoid them. There's also both potential for policy mistakes and opportunities when it comes to the workforce. I won't ask for a show of hands here, but if this room is representative of our members, small, medium, and large, the single number one common issue that's facing the business community is the inability to fill job openings with qualified applicants. And it's not just you. This is, if you're experiencing this problem, it's something that everyone else is experiencing all across the country. For this simple reason: that low unemployment rate and that growing economy has given us something we've never had before. We have more job openings than we have unemployed individuals. We actually have 1.3 jobs for every person, and that assumes that they're skilled, qualified, and ready to go to work in one of those 7.5 million jobs. Now, an economy grows based on two things: capital, investment, and also people. And because of demographic challenges, we are facing a crunch of people. So the opportunity for us is to pull people out of the shadows, off the sidelines, and into the workforce. We just launched a program through our foundation that's focused on getting the formerly incarcerated back into the workforce. One, it's good for them. It reduces recidivism. It's good for our communities. Happens to be the right thing to do. But it's also good for business. We need these individuals. We need to train them. We need to equip them with the skills, and we need to get them to work. We also have to focus on communities that have kind of been left behind in this recent spate of economic growth. So we're focusing on a talent pipeline program that focuses on going into the communities where we have people who don't have the skills that match the jobs, and using the private sector and local community colleges to give those individual skills. We're also paying attention to immigration. You know, one of the first things you do when you're in a hole, and we're currently in a hole with respect to available workers, is you don't keep digging. We have about 1 million individuals who either because they are dreamers or what's called long-term temporary protected status individuals are legally today in our workforce. Some of them may be your employees. The current immigration decisions going through the courts risk taking away those 1 million current workers. Now, 1 million in a population of over 330 million doesn't sound like a lot. But when you have these type of job numbers that we have here and the crunch that we have, we can't afford to make mistakes on immigration. We need to figure out how to maximize our domestic workforce and how to get a smart immigration policy that provides us with the workers and the consumers that are going to power our economy going forward. Healthcare. The single number one issue in the midterm elections was healthcare. And I suspect if we asked a room like this, if we asked you all your experience in dealing with health care for yourselves and for your employees, it's probably not a pretty one. Fewer options, opaque system, rising prices. It's not a coincidence that in this screwed up market that we have of health care, that one of the fastest growing expenditures, higher than inflation, higher than the cost of cars, higher than the cost of food, is the escalation in the cost of health care. And it's put it out of reach for too many Americans. But there's actually good news. You heard earlier that NIADA was with the president this week when he announced a new policy to make it easier for employers to provide different health care benefits to their employees. That's a good policy, and it's one that I'm glad to see your organization supporting. Another one that we're particularly excited about are called association health plans. Everyone's always complained that the big businesses can go out and they can negotiate a hell of a good deal for themselves and their employees, and it's a lot harder for a small business to do the same. Well, one of the ways we fix that is we make it easier for small businesses to pool together and get the leverage of group negotiating. And association health plans, which was a policy the Trump administration unveiled last year, does exactly that. It allows you, through a local chamber of commerce, maybe even your state auto dealer association. I was just talking to the folks at Napa Auto Parts. They're actually forming one just for their own Napa Auto Part dealer franchisees across the country so that they can pool together and buy health care. Now, this is a policy we fought very hard for at the Chamber. Unfortunately, as all too often happens today in Washington, someone who didn't like the policy decided to sue, and we're currently in court litigating to save this policy and the 3.7 million insured lives that it's expected to help cover and reduce costs for you and small businesses across the country. So this is an area where we have to fight to make sure the courts don't get it wrong and we get it right to help you and our economy continue to grow. A big one for us is also infrastructure. Don't have to tell you guys drive on the roads every day. The state of American infrastructure is piss poor. Next time you're in Washington, I hope the potholes don't kill you. It's interesting. We did a survey of chamber staff. It's amazing that about a quarter of our staff in Washington, D.C. had blown out a tire or had auto damage in the last 2 years because of the poor nature of our roads in that area. And that's just an exemplification of what we see all over the country. One of the reasons we're pushing hard for infrastructure now is because we have the wherewithal in the economy to support it and the opportunity to really invest in the future. It's one of those policy decisions that would put us back on a path towards growth. It's also an historical, I don't want to say anomaly, I'll say coincidence, that in the 1950s you had Dwight Eisenhower who could butt type and say, for the sake of national security, we're going to go on a national infrastructure program. And then, roughly a little over 30 years later, you had Ronald Reagan, who could cross party lines and work with the Speaker Tip O'Neill to rebuild and reinvigorate with the largest investment at that time in our nation's infrastructure. And Reagan was able to do it because he was able to convince Republicans that the investment that they were making in their taxes was a wise one. Now we have President Trump, who is a builder and who wants to build things, who has another historic opportunity to do another bipartisan partnership, this time with Speaker Pelosi, and really make the investments that we need to propel us into the next century. There's a lot of naysayers in Washington. Everyone talks about infrastructure, but you'll never get it done. The reality is we don't have a choice. We have to do it at some point, and we're better off doing it now when we can afford to make the investment and grow our economy rather than waiting until everything collapses under our feet. So here's an opportunity for us, and we're excited, and we actually think that of areas of progress, this is the one that we're going to surprise people the most with in the next year and a half by forging a bipartisan deal in Congress to finally get an infrastructure bill done. Now, forging that bipartisan consensus is easier said than done. And I want to spend the last couple minutes talking about something that at the Chamber we call a return to governing. All of us are sick of the partisanship and the polarization in Washington. You always see these historians who say, oh, yeah, it's bad now, but, it's been worse. I mean, we can go back to the Civil War, as if, by the way, that's an apt comparison, that we should throw everything back to a comparison of a succession of states in the bloodiest war our nation has ever faced. I suppose it was worse then, but that doesn't make today very good. Well, it's a problem that we're seeing not just at the federal level, but increasingly at the state level. Here's an interesting fact for you. In the 50 states of this union, 49 of them have bicameral legislatures. Nebraska's the oddball, sorry for anyone here from Nebraska, with its unicameral legislature. The rest of them have a House and have a Senate. Do you have any idea out of that 49 bicameral legislatures, how many are divided? One party controlling one House or Senate and the other one controlling the other? One. Minnesota. It's the only one today. The truth is, most of us live in either a blue state or a red state. And in that state that we live in, it's usually the governor and the legislature with supermajorities who control everything in that state. Of the states where you have divided government, my home state of Maryland, where I live now, we have a Republican governor and a Democratic legislature, but that Democratic legislature has a supermajority. The same in Massachusetts, where you have a governor of one party and a legislature of another. The same in Louisiana. Well, okay, that's fine. So people have sorted, and people like their parties where they live. Well, what does this mean from a national perspective? What it means is that we're increasingly living in two different worlds, with a set of rules in blue states and a set of rules in red states. And that's flipping itself over to the federal level. I talked earlier about the fact that the Trump administration had embarked on a deregulatory program that helped grow our economy. And I mentioned things like association health plans and the fact that we're in court today. Here's what we've watched happen. The Obama administration wrote a bunch of regulations that attorneys generals in red states went to court to block. The Trump administration comes in, writes a number of regulations, reversing many of the other ones, and attorneys generals from blue states sue to block that. What happens, and what all of this means, combined with the polarization that we see in Washington, is that we're on this giant seesaw where, depending on where you live and whether it's a red state or a blue state, or depending on who has the White House at any one moment, policy zigzags, seesaws back and forth in ways that make it really hard for businesses to plan. You talked earlier about the CFPB and the changes in some of those rules. It's great. It's been great news for auto dealers. It's been great news for consumers. Are we one election away from all of that going right back the other direction? How does that help you plan and grow your business if you're saying they're trying to weigh the business decisions that you make and wondering whether they're all going to be rolled back in less than 2 years? I talked about the decelerating economy. We've been out talking to our membership, and one of the things that we've been asking them in that deceleration is, why aren't you investing more? If you're a big manufacturer, why aren't you putting more money? The economy's good, people have money in their pockets. Why aren't you investing more in manufacturing here in the United States? And you know what they tell us? It's the uncertainty of the policy. 2 years out from an election, with all the court decisions and everything else hanging out, we don't really know what's going to happen. So we're going to sit on the sidelines for 2 years. We're going to see what the election produces, and then we'll make a decision about what to invest. Friends, that is not the American way. We do not operate businesses on a 2-year cycle where we decide to make plans to invest and to grow, and then we hit the pause button because there's an election about to happen, and we say, gosh, we'll see what's going to happen on the flip side of that, and maybe we'll either go a different direction or maybe we'll proceed with our plans. That's the kind of new dynamic that's in Washington and our state capitals that has the potential to kill the goose, and the goose is all of our American businesses, including all of you, that lays the golden egg of American prosperity. So what do we do about it? Well, we can curse at the TV, we can curse at our members of Congress, or we can begin to change the dynamics on our elected officials to encourage a rebuilding of the center, to compromise. I mentioned the Chamber's been around for 170 years. We've scored lawmakers based on their votes on legislation for the last 40 of those years. And we did it through a formula that was the same year in and year out. For the first time in 40 years, in January, we changed that formula. And we said members of Congress are going to get rewarded, whether they're Republican or Democrat, for crossing the aisle and working together. And that'll be part of their score, because what we need to do is rebuild a governing center so that irrespective of which party's in control, of the House, the Senate, or the White House, there are folks who care about what happens to the American business community, about the jobs that small businesses create, and how regulations and taxes and tariffs and other policies either help them do that or keep them from doing that. And it's all of our jobs to help build those relationships. It's also important for another reason. How many of you have all seen the stories about how all the young kids today, all the millennials, seem to have a fascination with socialism? You turn on any cable show, it feels like in some of these networks, and it's the rise of socialism. Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren or whoever else have convinced everyone that we should be socialist. Well, we've actually been out in the field and doing some research. Turns out that's not true. Turns out that support for socialism isn't any more than what it was before. Also turns out that no one knows what socialism is. But it's also true of something that shows a failing, at least we think on our part at the U.S. Chamber. They also aren't convinced as much as they used to be that capitalism and the free enterprise system is the best way to grow an economy, create jobs, and help each of us care for our families. And one of the things that we all have to do, we're all ambassadors. We're ambassadors from the U.S. Chamber. You all are ambassadors in your community. And we have to be out talking about the virtue of what a business can do, how it creates jobs, how it creates wealth, how it creates opportunities, and how it provides things that consumers want. And there's no one better to do that than all of you. Just last night in Atlanta, the U.S. Chamber hosted 2 focus groups of non-college educated millennials to talk to them about capitalism and socialism and the free market and how they thought we were doing as a country. Here's some good news. They think we're on the right track economically. They have more faith in a free enterprise system than what the pundits on cable TV would lead you to believe. Here's the bad news. they don't trust a lot of people anymore. They don't trust government. They certainly don't trust big business. They don't trust folks from Washington. Our big takeaway from that, and it was the last question that our focus group moderator asked, was, when you think about the economy and the future and the importance of business, who would you like to hear from? Would you like to hear from, big CEOs who've done really well and created lots of wealth? No, don't trust them. Would you like to hear from politicians? Hell no, we certainly don't trust them. Who would you like to hear from? Turns out they want to hear from people in their community who they trust, whose faces they've seen before, who maybe their family has done business with, who are willing to talk about their own experience and what they see happening. Friends, that's all of you. If I could leave you with one thing here today, it's this. Help us both restore the governing center, but also the great promise that is America, the great promise that each generation will truly have it better off than the generation before, the free enterprise system that made all of that possible. If we lose that belief, it doesn't matter if we get the policies right, we'll have lost the underpinnings and the undercore of everything that makes us who we are. We can't count on folks from Washington to do it. We can't count on our elected officials. This is going to be a time similar to the time that President Taft faced 107 years ago, where you have to have the wisdom to say the best ambassadors, the best brand messengers to instill confidence in the American economy and our future are the small businesses across this country who are doing it every day. Thank you for being here. Thank you for everything you do through NIADA. I really appreciate the opportunity to spend a little bit of time with you.